But when Homeowners Association President Karen Blackwell decided she wanted my lake for her own purposes, she was willing to destroy everything I'd worked for to get it. This is the story of how one woman's greed nearly cost me my home, my sanity, and my faith in justice itself. But it's also the story of how I learned that sometimes, when you're fighting for what matters most, you have to be willing to pull the plug on everything. Act 1 Setup. The trouble started 18 months ago, though I didn't recognize it at the time. I was sitting on my back porch one August evening, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson, when a black sedan wound its way up my gravel drive. The car looked expensive and out of place against the rustic backdrop of pine trees and weathered fence posts. A woman stepped out tall, perfectly coiffed, wearing a business suit that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. She moved with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. "Mr. Henderson?" Her voice carried across the yard with practiced authority. "I'm Karen Blackwell, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." I set down my coffee and walked to meet her, genuinely puzzled. "I think there's been some mistake, ma'am. I'm not part of any HOA. This property has been in my family since 1987. Karen's smile was sharp as winter wind. "That's exactly what I need to discuss with you, Mr. Henderson. May I come in?" Against my better judgment, I invited her inside. She perched on the edge of my leather sofa like a hawk surveying prey, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "Mr. Henderson, I have some news that might come as a surprise," she began, her tone sickeningly sweet. "Last year, the county rezoned this entire area. Your property, along with 43 others, now falls under the jurisdiction of our homeowners association." My stomach dropped. "That's impossible. I would have received notice." "The notices were sent to all property owners of record," Karen replied smoothly. "Perhaps there was an issue with your mail service. Regardless, you're now subject to our covenants, conditions, and restrictions." She slid a bound document across my coffee table. The thing was easily 40 pages long, dense with legal jargon and restrictions that made my head spin. "I need time to review this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course." Karen stood, smoothing her skirt. "But I should mention, there are some immediate concerns we need to address. Your lake, for instance." "What about my lake?" "It's quite lovely, but it's not up to community standards. The shoreline needs professional landscaping, the dock requires safety upgrades, and frankly, the recreational potential is being wasted on just one family." The way she said it made my skin crawl. This woman had been on my property for all of 10 minutes, and she was already criticizing the lake my grandfather had helped me stock with trout, where I'd taught my children to swim, where I'd scattered my wife Margaret's ashes just 2 years prior. "Mrs. Blackwell," I said, standing to show her out with all due respect, "my lake is private property. It's not going anywhere." Her smile faltered for just a moment, revealing something cold underneath. "We'll see about that, Mr. Henderson. I'll expect your signed compliance documents within 30 days. After she left, I sat in my empty cabin trying to process what had just happened. Outside, the lake stretched peaceful and undisturbed, just as it had every evening for decades. How could everything change so suddenly? I should have called a lawyer that night. Instead, I convinced myself it was all a misunderstanding that would sort itself out. That was my first mistake. Act 2 Escalation. The harassment started small, so small I almost dismissed it as coincidence. First, it was the letters. They arrived every few days, each one detailing new violations I'd supposedly committed. My cabin's logs were the wrong shade of brown. My gravel driveway created excessive dust. My vegetable garden violated aesthetic standards. Each letter came with a fine: $50, $100, $250. When I called the number listed on the letterhead, a bored-sounding woman informed me that all disputes had to be submitted in writing within 10 days, or the fines would double. "This is ridiculous," I told my neighbor, Pete Martinez, when he stopped by to check on me. Pete had lived in the area almost as long as I had, and his property bordered mine to the south. "Same thing's happening to half the folks around here," Pete said, shaking his head. Karen's got her sights set on turning this whole area into some kind of luxury development. Word is, she's got investors lined up. What kind of investors? The kind that build vacation resorts. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the October wind. They can't just take our properties. Maybe not directly, Pete said, but they can sure make life miserable enough that people want to sell. As if to prove his point, the next escalation came just 3 days later. I was splitting firewood behind the cabin when I heard voices coming from the direction of the lake. Loud voices. Lots of them. I grabbed my walking stick and headed down the trail, expecting to find trespassers I'd need to politely but firmly ask to leave. Instead, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. A surveyor in an orange vest was taking measurements along my shoreline, while Karen Blackwell stood nearby, gesturing animatedly at my dock and boathouse. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice sharper than intended. "This is private property." Karen turned, and her expression was pure satisfaction. "Actually, Mr. Henderson, we're conducting an environmental assessment. The HOA has concerns about water quality and safety compliance." Environmental assessment? You can't just walk onto my land without permission. The surveyor looked uncomfortable, glancing between Karen and me. Karen, however, looked like she was enjoying herself. According to Section 12.3 of the CC&Rs you signed, the HOA has the right to inspect any amenity that impacts community welfare, she said, pulling out yet another document. "Your lake feeds into the creek that runs through our development. That makes it our business." I never signed anything. Your failure to return the compliance documents within the required time frame constituted acceptance of all terms, Karen replied smoothly. "It's all perfectly legal." I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. "Get off my property, now." Karen's smile was triumphant. "We'll be finished here within the hour. I suggest you use that time to review your options, Mr. Henderson. The HOA is prepared to be very generous with a buyout offer." "I'm not selling." "Everyone has a price," she said, "even you." That night, I finally did what I should have done months earlier. I called a lawyer. Act 3 Discovery and Reversal. Attorney Sarah Chen was recommended by Pete's brother-in-law, and from the moment I walked into her office, I knew I'd found someone who took the situation seriously. "This is worse than I thought," Sarah said after reviewing the stack of documents I'd brought. "They're using a legal maneuver called annexation by development. Essentially, when the county rezoned your area, it created an opportunity for existing HOAs to expand their boundaries. But I never agreed to join." That's where it gets tricky. Colorado law has a provision that allows involuntary inclusion if certain conditions are met. The problem is, those conditions are supposed to include proper notification and a hearing process. Sarah leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her desk. "Tell me about this rezoning. When exactly did it happen?" Karen said it was last year, but I never received any notices. "We need to verify that. If they bypassed proper notification procedures, we might have grounds to challenge the entire annexation." It took Sarah's investigator 3 weeks to uncover the truth, and when she called me with the results, her voice was tight with controlled anger. "David, you need to sit down for this. The rezoning vote happened in a closed county commissioner meeting. No public notice. No comment period. And here's the interesting part. Karen Blackwell's development company made a substantial donation to the commissioner's re-election campaign just 2 months before the vote. My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone. That's corruption. It gets worse. I've found similar patterns in 3 other counties. Karen's been systematically targeting rural properties with valuable natural features, lakes, mountain views, mineral rights. She annexes them into her HOA, makes life hell for the owners, then swoops in with buyout offers at below market value. How many families has she done this to? At least 17 that I can confirm. David, this woman isn't just a difficult neighbor. She's running a criminal enterprise. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. What do? We fight back. But I have to warn you, she's got deep pockets and political connections. This is going to get ugly before it gets better. Sarah's prediction proved accurate within days. I was awakened at 2 a.m. by the sound of heavy machinery. Stumbling to my front window, I watched in horror as a convoy of trucks rumbled up my driveway, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. By morning, they had erected a chain-link fence around my entire lake. The sign posted on the gate read, DANGEROUS, WATERCONDIEAAAS, IUTHORIZEDPERSONNLY, WHISPERINGPINESHOA. When I called the sheriff's department, Deputy Rodriguez seemed genuinely sympathetic, but ultimately helpless. Mr. Henderson, they've filed an emergency environmental order with the county health department. Until it's resolved, they have the legal authority to restrict access. It's my lake. I understand your frustration, sir, but my hands are tied. You'll need to work this out through the courts. That afternoon, Karen showed up at my door again, this time accompanied by 2 men in expensive suits. Mr. Henderson, she said, her tone now openly condescending, I think it's time we had a serious conversation about your situation. One of the suits stepped forward. I'm Richard Steinberg, representing Whispering Pines Development LLC. We're prepared to offer you $400,000 for your property. I nearly laughed. This land is worth 3 times that. Not anymore, Karen said. The environmental assessment found significant contamination issues. Cleanup costs alone would exceed $500,000. You're lying. The county health department disagrees, Steinberg said, handing me another document. You have 30 days to accept our offer or face potential criminal liability for environmental damage. After they left, I sat on my porch staring at the fence around my lake, feeling more defeated than I'd felt since Margaret's death. They had turned my sanctuary into a prison, and there seemed to be nothing I could do about it. That's when my phone rang. David, Sarah's voice was electric with excitement. I just got off the phone with a hydrologist at the State Environmental Agency. That contamination report? It's completely fabricated. The water samples were never actually taken from your lake. What do you mean? I mean, Karen Blackwell just made her first major mistake. Falsifying environmental reports is a federal crime. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Act 4 Showdown. 3 days before the emergency HOA meeting, where Karen planned to finalize the environmental seizure of my property, I received a visitor I never expected. Linda Vasquez had been Karen's assistant for 6 years. She was a quiet woman in her 50s who had always struck me as competent but unremarkable during our few brief encounters. When she appeared at my door that evening, clutching a manila envelope and looking terrified, I barely recognized her. Mr. Henderson, she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder, I need to talk to you. What Karen's doing? It's not right. I invited her in, and over coffee, Linda revealed the scope of Karen's operation. She's been planning this for 2 years, Linda said, her hands trembling as she opened the envelope. Your property isn't the first, and it won't be the last. She has a whole system worked out. The documents Linda had brought were explosive. Internal emails between Karen and her investors. Fake environmental reports from 3 different properties. Bank records showing payoffs to county officials. And most damning of all, architectural plans for a luxury resort complex called Lakeside Paradise, complete with my cabin marked for demolition and my lake turned into a private beach club. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Linda's eyes filled with tears. "Because my grandfather lost his farm the same way, back in Texas. I watched what it did to him, fighting people with more money and power. He died still fighting, and I swore I'd never be part of something like that." "Linda, you realize what this means? If we expose this, Karen will face serious criminal charges." "I know, but I can't live with myself if I don't try to stop her." The emergency HOA meeting was held at the community center in town. By the time I arrived with Sarah, the parking lot was packed. Word had gotten out that something big was happening, and half the county had shown up to watch. Inside, Karen sat at the head table looking supremely confident, flanked by her board members and legal team. She had dressed for victory an immaculate navy suit and pearls that caught the fluorescent lights. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen began, once the room settled, "we're here tonight to address a serious environmental threat to our community. Mr. Henderson's lake has been found to contain dangerous levels of contamination that pose an immediate risk to public health." The room erupted in concerned murmurs. Karen let the noise build before continuing. "The Whispering Pines HOA is prepared to take immediate action to remediate this situation. We will be assuming management of the lake effective immediately, with full cleanup and restoration to begin next month." That's when Sarah stood up. "Mrs. Blackwell," she said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "before you proceed, I think the community deserves to know the truth about these contamination reports." Karen's composure cracked slightly. "I'm sorry, but this is an HOA meeting. Non-residents don't have speaking privileges." "Actually," Sarah replied, "I'm here representing 17 property owners who have been victims of your fraudulent annexation scheme." The room went dead silent. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "I have in my possession evidence of systematic corruption, including falsified environmental reports, bribery of county officials, and criminal conspiracy to defraud property owners." Karen shot to her feet. "This is outrageous. Security, please escort this woman out." But Sarah was just getting started. She pulled out Linda's documents and began reading from the emails, her voice echoing in the stunned silence. With each revelation, Karen's face grew paler. The coup de grace came when Sarah projected the architectural plans for Lakeside Paradise onto the wall. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Blackwell doesn't want to clean up Mr. Henderson's lake. She wants to turn it into a private resort for wealthy investors, and she's willing to destroy families and communities to do it." The room erupted in chaos. Residents who had been fined and harassed for months suddenly understood what had been happening to them. Karen's own board members were staring at her in shock and horror. Karen made one last desperate play. "This is all lies and fabrication," she shouted over the noise. "Mr. Henderson is a bitter old man who can't accept that his property doesn't meet community standards." That's when Deputy Rodriguez walked in with 3 FBI agents. The federal investigation had been triggered by Sarah's complaint about interstate fraud, but Linda's evidence had accelerated everything. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, she looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Henderson," she hissed. But I knew it was. Act 5 Resolution. 6 months later, I sat on my dock watching the sun set over my lake, finally at peace for the first time in 2 years. Karen Blackwell was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and corruption. Her development company was liquidated, and the proceeds were used to compensate the families she had victimized. The county commissioners who had taken her bribes were voted out of office, and new legislation was passed requiring public hearings for all rezoning decisions. Most importantly, my property, along with all the others that had been illegally annexed, was restored to its original status. The fraudulent HOA was dissolved, and its assets were distributed to cover legal fees and damages. Linda Vasquez received whistleblower protection and found a new job with the State Attorney General's office, investigating HOA fraud cases. She later told me that our case had opened up investigations in 12 other states. The room went dead silent. Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. I have in my possession evidence of systematic corruption, including falsified environmental reports, bribery of county officials, and criminal conspiracy to defraud property owners. Karen shot to her feet. This is outrageous. Security, please escort this woman out. But Sarah was just getting started. She pulled out Linda's documents and began reading from the emails, her voice echoing in the stunned silence. With each revelation, Karen's face grew paler. The coup de grace came when Sarah projected the architectural plans for Lakeside Paradise onto the wall. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Blackwell doesn't want to clean up Mr. Henderson's lake. She wants to turn it into a private resort for wealthy investors, and she's willing to destroy families and communities to do it. The room erupted in chaos. Residents who had been fined and harassed for months suddenly understood what had been happening to them. Karen's own board members were staring at her in shock and horror. Karen made one last desperate play. "This is all lies and fabrication," she shouted over the noise. "Mr. Henderson is a bitter old man who can't accept that his property doesn't meet community standards." That's when Deputy Rodriguez walked in with 3 FBI agents. The federal investigation had been triggered by Sarah's complaint about interstate fraud, but Linda's evidence had accelerated everything. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, she looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Henderson," she hissed. But I knew it was. Act 5, Resolution. 6 months later, I sat on my dock, watching the sun set over my lake, finally at peace for the first time in 2 years. Karen Blackwell was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and corruption. Her development company was liquidated, and the proceeds were used to compensate the families she had victimized. The county commissioners who had taken her bribes were voted out of office, and new legislation was passed, requiring public hearings for all rezoning decisions. Most importantly, my property, along with all the others that had been illegally annexed, was restored to its original status. The fraudulent HOA was dissolved, and its assets were distributed to cover legal fees and damages. Linda Vasquez received whistleblower protection and found a new job with the State Attorney General's office, investigating HOA fraud cases. She later told me that our case had opened up investigations in 12 other states. Pete Martinez stopped by that evening, bringing a 6-pack of beer and his usual wry smile. "So," he said, settling into the Adirondack chair beside me, "any regrets about not taking that buyout offer?" I chuckled, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Not a one. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight nearly kills you. I looked out at the lake, where a family of deer had come down to drink at the water's edge. In the distance, a loon called across the water, the same sound that had welcomed me home every evening for 37 years. "Especially then," I said. "The truth is, I learned something important during those dark months when it seemed like Karen might actually win. Home isn't just about the land you own or the buildings you live in. It's about the memories you've made, the values you're willing to defend, and the community of people who stand with you when things get tough." Karen Blackwell tried to take all of that away from me. She nearly succeeded. But in the end, her greed became her weakness, and the very corruption she thought made her untouchable became the evidence that brought her down. Sometimes justice takes longer than we'd like. Sometimes it requires us to risk everything we hold dear. But when it finally comes, when truth wins out over power and community triumphs over greed, the victory is sweeter than any sunset over any lake could ever be. Would you have fought as hard to save your sanctuary? Or would you have taken the money and walked away? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've had your own experiences with HOA overreach or neighborhood bullies, I'd love to hear your stories. Sometimes, the best defense against injustice is simply knowing you're not alone in the fight. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found it helpful or inspiring, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share these stories, not just for entertainment, but to remind each other that ordinary people can stand up to extraordinary corruption, and sometimes we actually win. Until next time, hold your ground, know your rights, and never let anyone convince you that your home isn't worth fighting for.